Hi, everybody. This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. And today we're going to jumpstart on understanding Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This is an important jumpstart. You should have been reading with me on the first part, and I told you when we read the first part of 8 parts that I'm going to jumpstart your understanding, and that's important. So hopefully you read the first part, and now we're going to do some understanding and jumpstart your understanding if you stick with the other 7 parts. This is a tough book. So Jimmy wanted to give you a jumpstart after reading the first part. Why? Well, because the remaining 7 readings are a journey. It's a journey into the depths of your own self. And before you say anything, oh, Jimmy, what are you talking about? Well, it's a dangerous journey, and it's one filled with doubt, anger, fear, courage, disbelief, faith. There's other words I could have threw up here, but that's what you do when you journey into yourself, or it's not. In other words, some of you, I'm not saying all of you, I'm not saying most of you, I'm saying some of you, some may decide not to finish the story, the novel, right? Notes from Underground. Some of you have already decided, and you're probably peeking in on this analysis, or perhaps halfway through the first reading, you said, I can't take this. And on the other hand, some of you will have asked yourself, why the hell should I read about this character, this idiot? And that's all okay. These kind of reactions, that's all okay. You can't be expected to react any way than the way you react. But this story is not for everyone, and it's certainly not for the faint of heart. What does that mean? Well, that means if you're afraid to know a little bit about yourself, that you may not like. Why? Well, because those who read it will be troubled. I'm telling you right now, you're going to struggle. Perhaps you'll find some truth in what the narrator is telling us about himself that lies within each of us, within you, within me. By talking to, quote, gentlemen, as you saw, they're never identified in this story. Besides, it is a diary. We're gonna talk about that. Is this narrator talking to anybody? Is he talking to a group? Is he talking to himself? You know, when we read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations together, that was Marcus talking to Marcus. That was his little diary, talking to himself about what it means to be an emperor. Well, in this case, we've got an anonymous narrator talking to himself in his diary about him. Notes from Underground, not understand, underground, heavens to Murgatroyd, is a remarkable narrating technique for what people call introspection. You can look that up. But I did it for you. It's the examination or observation of your own mental or emotional processes. Well, Jimmy, what are those? Well, that's the stuff you go through when you make a decision. That's the stuff you go through in living your life day to day. When you wake up and you see a person, you make a judgment, don't you? You don't want to, but you do. Just like people judge you when they don't know you sometimes. And introspection is judging yourself, looking at yourself, taking an honest look at yourself. And that's hard to do. It's hard to admit that you are, in fact, not important. What do you mean? I'm important, Jimmy. Well, maybe, but you're not. You're just a human being like all of us. And who likes to really look at themselves, you know? Reading this novel is also a journey that only a writer like Dostoevsky could have accomplished. Dostoevsky is Jimmy's favorite author, and for many reasons, and is the only one. He's the only author that carries you into your own self so deeply. Almost all classical literature takes us into ourselves. Hamlet did that. Lysistrata did that. All classical literature does that. A.M.P., the short story, did that. Right? It makes us look at ourselves because I told you study classical literature to read how other people lead their lives in order to lead your own. But Dostoevsky in his novels, and this is the first of many, hopefully we'll read on the website, he does it differently than other people. Quite frankly, in my study of literature, I've never come across a guy like this. So, and I can't really sleep after I read his novels. That's why I divided this one into 8 parts. He's troubling. He's going to change your life if you give him a chance. Or not, or he won't. So whether you give him a chance, that's up to you. But like all classical literature, it's up to you what you pull from that literature, what you learn from it, just like reading Hamlet, as I just mentioned. Because though they show us characters, like this guy that's talking to us in this novel, Notes from Underground, they become more real than real life itself. Now, how can you say that, Jimmy? Well, you can't really see in another person's head. You can only see in your head. And sometimes when you look inside your head, you don't even want to see what you see, right? Oh, I could never have done that. And yet you end up doing it, right? You don't know. It's introspection. Dostoevsky said, in their novels and short stories, writers most often try to choose and present vividly and artistically social types, which are extremely seldom encountered in real life, but which are nevertheless more real than real life itself. Well, Jimmy, I don't understand that. Well, read it again. The things you read in classical literature, the characters you read in classical literature, not the dime store novel, not the crap that's produced, pulp fiction, all that stuff, but the classical literature, the characters they paint are more real than real life itself. The reason being that the narrator, a good narrator, third-person narrator or first-person. For example, when we read Farewell to Arms together, that was a first-person narrator. The narrator was Lieutenant Henry, right? He was in there telling us the story, which had already happened. And so we questioned that and analyzed it, and we learned a lot about him, didn't we? We learned a lot about this guy just by him talking to us and us listening. Well, it's the same thing here. We're going to learn about this guy, even though if you read part 1, you're saying, I don't even know what the hell this guy's talking about. But you will. That's why I'm jump-starting your understanding. All right? Unlike other storytellers, Dostoevsky narrators, usually they're the third person. When we read his other novels, they're third person. They're outstanding deep thinkers. They question everything, existence, morality, their position in the universe, life, just like Marcus Aurelius did when he was writing in his diaries. Dostoevsky's use of characters and narrators is unduplicated in literature. And some people reading this are going to be professors, I'm sure. If they say, well, I already read it, Jimmy. I'm an academic. I teach. Well, that's good. But Dostoevsky's use of characters is unduplicated. You will never, ever, ever, of course, it depends on the translation, but you will never, ever, ever find anyone who takes you into the depths of yourself more than Dostoevsky. Each piece of classical literature offers us how other people lead their lives. But Dostoevsky, he's just a little different. He probes much more about who we are and the depths of our existence. And like I said at the beginning of this jumpstart in understanding, you may not want to go there. You may want to not go there. But you should. Because what he explores is what we are down deep when no one else is looking. Some call Dostoevsky the father of existentialism. It's a philosophy that you should learn about sometime. Some only read him superficially, which we're not going to do. We never read classical literature on this website superficially. I once worked for the head of our department of special education a long time ago who asked who my favorite author was as I was coming in as a teacher of English. I said without hesitation, Dostoevsky, and she said, he was really concerned about the poor people, wasn't he? At that moment, the minute she said that, I knew she didn't really read Dostoevsky with an understanding. Of course, he was concerned about poor people, but he only used poor people as a means to discussing what you really feel inside yourself when you look at a poor person. I remember coming off the expressway on a trip with my wife, and there was a guy hanging on the pole as we exited. This was in San Francisco, just a homeless guy. He had a McDonald's cup there, and we pulled on him, and we pulled up to the stop sign where he was hanging on the pole, just hanging with his one arm and leaning into the cars and swaying, not from the breeze, but just swaying. Perhaps he was, who knows? But the word out of his mouth was, amnesty, amnesty. He was looking for money, of course, right? So I gave him $1, and my wife said, why did you do that? I said, well, there go we, but the grace of God. I mean, who knows what this guy is going on inside his head? And you don't know, and that's the value, ladies and gentlemen, of literature, is that authors like Dostoevsky, when they have great narrators like this anonymous narrator Notes from Underground, give us a glimpse inside a person that we can compare now to our own insight into ourselves. Okay? For now, I want to make you just jumpstart on understanding this narrator, because in many ways, you're reading about yourself, though you may not realize it. Jimmy, I'm not anything like this guy. Are you kidding? I read that first part with you, and holy mackerel, there's nothing like him. I'm not like that at all. Well, before you say that, finish the 8 parts, okay? Finish all 8 parts with me. Would you promise me that? Would you make a commitment now to finish all 8 parts before you say you're not like this guy? Because when I read this at first, I didn't think I'm like this guy. But not only am I like this guy, I can guarantee you you're like this guy. You may not know it, you may not want to admit it, but we're all like this to a degree. I am not like him, Jimmy. Okay, good. But read it and then tell me that. And before you say, how can you say that? Let's take a look. All right. The novel starts out with an author's note. You remember this, and immediately you understand this is not a normal novel opening. We've read a lot of novels together on this website. Novels usually don't start like this, do they? And usually it begins with the story. Call Me Ishmael, whatever. It's like the opening of movies or television series that say only the names have been changed to protect the innocent, right? That's what the author, Fyodor Dostoevsky, has to say. Now, this was published in 1864, a long time ago. And it was called Notes from Underground or Letters from the Underground. Dostoevsky inserts himself into his novel with this note saying that the author we're going to read has produced a diary. The author of the diary itself, are, of course, imaginary. So Dostoevsky is telling the reader, I just made this stuff up. And why does he say that? Why does the author, Dostoevsky, say, the author, like a double whammy, right? The author of the diary and the diary itself are imaginary. In other words, it's not real, right? Why does he say that? Do you know why? Can you guess why? Well, because he doesn't want to scare people, right? The author is produced, however, he states that people like this must exist. Because he already knows when you start reading this, you're not going to believe a word. You may say, what the hell am I talking about here, right? But he also tells you that people like this must exist in society, considering the circumstances which were society's form. There are people like this. For example, regardless of how long you've been alive, you realize the complexity of people. There's different personalities, there's different needs, people have different characteristics, there's all sorts of different people. Would you agree with that? So there's no way you can know everybody. There's no way you can know deep down inside what someone's thinking, except through literature like this, classical literature. So the I in that premise up there is Dostoevsky in this author's notes. So when he says, I have tried to expose to the view of the public, he, the narrator inside the story, is one of the representatives of a generation. So I is Dostoevsky, he is the anonymous narrator that he's going to expose. In this fragment, it's a piece entitled Underground, this person introduces himself, and in the second part, second fragment, he's going to give notes about his life. So he makes it plain and clear that he's exposing something that exists, right? So he is the narrator. Dostoevsky says he is one of the representatives of a generation still living. So there's two parts, the first part and then the second part. We just read part 1 of 8 parts, and this is still, we're in part 1, where what? He describes his representative entitled, the person introduces himself and his views. We're learning about him. Well, I don't have views like that. Well, of course you don't, or you don't think you do. So then the author's note is a sort of preface that Dostoevsky, because he felt it was probably a little weird, this story. So he wanted to give the readers a note up front that, hey, I understand. It's going to be a little weird. But nevertheless, the preface, frames the story, frames it, gives you an idea. And from then on, the anonymous narrator takes over. And it's the first-person narration. So once we start the fragment, the diary, what he's talking about here, it becomes first-person narration. The narrator is inside the story. Jimmy always emphasizes you got to know the position of the narrator. It's just like if you were in a room falling through space without windows, you would not know you're even falling, would you? You would have no reference point. Knowing who the narrator is, where the narrator is in reference to the story, is your reference point. And every story you read with me, I'm going to talk about the narrator's position. Is he inside or is he outside? That's very important to understanding what you're reading. Just like in life, we're all first-person narrators, right? I got up this morning. I washed my face. I'm in the story. I'm in the story of life, right? But there's other people who may be watching you, not when you get up, but when you're walking. I saw Jimmy walking down the street, even though they don't know me as Jimmy, right? I saw a man walking down the street. That's a third-person narrator saying that. I saw the third-person narrator would say that man was walking down the street. He wouldn't say I saw. The minute you use I, you're in the story. Unless it's a quotation, right? So Jimmy always told you the first part, paragraph, page is very important. It sets the tone. And it pulls you into the story. So I want you to note the first sentence. The I is the anonymous narrator. And he says right off the bat, ladies and gentlemen, that he's sick and spiteful. I am a sick man, ... the ellipse, right? He tells you, I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unattractive. 3, boom, boom. He's telling you, I'm spiteful. I'm sick. I'm unattractive. What does spiteful mean? Spiteful, Google tells us, is showing or caused by malice. Caused by malice, spiteful. So what's malice? Well, malice is the intention or desire to do evil and ill will. Right? Spite. You've heard that. You've heard the word perhaps. Oh, you're just being spiteful. Malice. You're showing malice, ill will. So up front, let's just ask this. Stop at the third sentence, right? I am an unattractive man. I am spiteful. Do you have someone, right? So up front, we have someone who's sick, has bad intentions. Do you know anyone who's going to admit that to you? Notice the pause I made. Do you know, ladies and gentlemen, do you know anyone that's going to tell you, hi, I'm spiteful. I'm sick. Sorry. No, nobody's going to say that, even when you are spiteful, right? But if you're sick, you're going to find out if you read the first part with me. You're going to tell everyone, oh, I don't feel good, right? Forget that for a moment. But I don't know anyone who will say, I'm spiteful. Do you? Or I'm unattractive. I'm ugly. You know anybody who'll say that? Have you admitted it to yourself about yourself? Are you spiteful? And if you are, will you admit it or you'll just brush it off? Do you ever have bad intentions? What do you think? Stop for a moment. If you answered yes, or perhaps to those questions, how can you say that this novel is not about us, about people, right? It already should spark your interest and say, who the hell would admit this? And I want to learn more about them. So this is why I referred to you as the novel as a journey. It's a journey. Because at some time in your life, I am absolutely positively, email me, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, that you have felt spite. You have felt malice. You have felt ill will. You felt it. You feel these things. Maybe it passes. Maybe it doesn't. In this case, you're going to find out it doesn't with this guy. But if you haven't felt that, then reading about this guy and his spite is going to fulfill my promise to you. You're going to learn how others lead their life and how to lead yours, or in this case, how not to lead yours. Because it's not good to be spiteful. I'm not just telling you. So whether you felt spite or not, the novel explores spite like no other novel ever did. So, and we've seen when we've read classics literature, people do things out of spite, right? The narrator adds that he's unattractive. Well, this means, as we see when we read, an idea of what is attractive is in his head. He says, I'm ugly. I'm unattractive. Well, is he, or is he just looking for a compliment? Then he launches into talking about his liver and how he thinks it is disease. All right. He goes back here. He says, I believe my liver is diseased. What makes him say that? Because look at the next sentence. However, I know nothing at all about my disease. And I do not know for certain what ails me. I don't know what ails me. Something ails him. Something ail. I hurt. Something's hurting him. I think my liver, but I don't know. And I don't consult a doctor for it. What's it? The ailment, right? The illness. He does have an illness. We're going to talk about that. And I never have consulted a doctor, though I have a great respect for medicine and doctors. Besides, I'm extremely superstitious, sufficiently so to respect medicine. Anyway, parentheses, notice the parentheses. This is very important when he talks. It's like a sidebar. I am well educated enough not to be superstitious, but I am superstitious. Okay. I'm educated enough not to be superstitious, but I'm superstitious. Do you think that's a contradiction? If you haven't guessed already, and if you read part 1 with me, this guy's full of contradictions, and that's why you have to have careful reading. And well, Jimmy, how's that like real life? Ladies and gentlemen, do you know anyone who is not contradictory at one point in his life or her life? Do you know? We abound. We're human beings. We abound in contradictions, right? We abound in them. So something's making him sick. He doesn't know why, but there's contradiction. So at this point, you would have to give up reading, right? Maybe you say, I just don't want to read about this. This is stupid. It's boring. I'd rather read about adventure. Well, guess what? That's part of the theme of the book. This guy suffers from thinking too much. Someone told my wife once, you think too much, Auntie. Thinking too much is interesting than taking action. Thinking versus acting. Keep that in mind. But if you're reading this with me, go back and reread part 1 after we're done with the analysis. So remember, he's writing in his diary. And a diary is a personal record of events, thoughts, feelings. You write them down on a daily basis. And essentially, it's a book where someone documents experiences, reflections, blah, 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 usually to be kept private. You understand? A diary is a private thing for the writer's eyes only. According to Google, well, who cares about what Google says? You talk to yourself in a diary. Jimmy has kept a diary since he was 17 years old. You didn't know that about me, did you? Diary is a way you clarify. The diary, when you write down in a diary your feelings, your emotions, and you read them the next day, often your reaction is, what the hell was going on in my mind when I wrote that? That's what you do when you write your thoughts out. This is a very essential gift, curse, whatever you want to call it, to help clarify your journey into yourself. You shouldn't be afraid, although you should be, of what you'll find when you do introspection. Let me put it this way. The myth of Sisyphus is a guy who was cursed by the gods for giving mankind fire or whatever. But his penalty for helping mankind was to roll a rock up a hill and never reach the top. It's called the myth of Sisyphus. There was a famous essay about it. But poor Sisyphus would roll the rock, almost get to the top, and then the rock, he'd never make it, then the rock would roll back down, and he had to go back down and roll it back up. So up, down, up, down, up, down, for eternity. Can you imagine doing that? So existentialism took that myth and said that's really what life's about. It's absurd. It's stupid to roll a rock and never get to the top. But then they figured out, and I don't want to get into it, we can do that at another time, that it's not getting to the top that's important. It's rolling the rock. It's the journey that's important. You understand? Pleasure in rolling the rock and the journey, not getting to the top. And besides, you never reach the top. There's always another top, right? Anyway, diaries are good. Perhaps only people who keep diaries are going to understand this anonymous narrator. I don't know. But I do know you should, if you're going to look and start thinking about the journey into yourself, Notes from Underground is a great way to start. So he thinks his liver is diseased, but he doesn't know anything about disease. But something obviously is disease, which is what this book is about. Is what is the ailment that he suffers from? Keep that in mind. I'm not going to tell you the answer. Part of the answer is that he thinks too much, but we're going to talk about that. So keep in mind what exactly is wrong with this guy. And I'm going to give you a hint. Here's a free hint. It's not his liver. It's not. He never consulted a doctor, blah, blah, blah. The narrator uses parentheses, remember this, because they are like asides to himself. Oh, by the way. In this one, he says he's educated not, but he's educated anyway to be superstitious. What does being superstitious mean? Well, it means you believe in ideas about luck or magic rather than science or reason. So he's educated enough not to believe in luck and magic, but he believes in it anyway. And you're going to see that science or reason versus luck or magic, and which is actually freedom, is probably one of the main ideas. This is about free will, free choice, determinism. Right? You can write those down. In any case, he believes medicine is superstitious. No, he says, I refuse to consult a doctor from spite. I'm not going to do it. Damn it. That you probably will not understand. Well, who's you? Well, I understand it, though. Who's you? I refuse to consult a doctor from spite that you probably will not understand. Who's you? Whoever he's writing to. Well, he's writing to himself. Is he schizophrenic? Is he mentally ill? Perhaps not. We'll have to prove it as we read the story. We'll find out in a little bit that he's really talking to somebody called gentleman. He's addressing gentlemen. Now, are there gentlemen that he's addressing, or are they all in his mind? You have to answer these questions. Who do you talk to when you talk to yourself? Do you talk to yourself? Or do you talk to an imaginary friend? I'm kidding. Who is you? Well, if he's writing in his diary and the diary is written to himself, who is you? Well, we know his I is him. I refuse. And he understands what he is saying, but that you is interesting, isn't it? So you're going to have to continue reading to find out. I'll give you a hint. The you is actually the gentlemen, which do not exist. Stream of consciousness. Google tells us that stream of consciousness writing technique is credited to the psychologist William James, who you should read sometime, who used the term in the Principles of Psychology in 1890 to describe the continuous flow of a person's conscious thoughts as a stream. Now, when you think, ladies and gentlemen, you don't use punctuation, do you? I'm reading with Jimmy, period. I don't really like what this story is telling me, period. Exclamation point. Scratch that out. You don't think like that. You just think, right? Words are coming to your mind, images. In fact, words and images are scattered in your stream of consciousness. That's what consciousness is, isn't it? So many writers use stream of consciousness. James Joyce is probably one of the most famous. In his book Ulysses, there's a whole chapter written in stream of consciousness, which means no punctuation. You have to be a dedicated reader to understand what the hell he's talking about. But he uses it. He's not the only one who used it. Actually, William Faulkner, a great American writer, used it in As I Lay Dying, which we will read on this website. In his book, so Notes from Underground as a diary mirrors this technique. It's stream of consciousness. He's writing his thoughts out. Bam! Sometimes like a machine gun. So the narrator jumps around. He jumps around from idea to concept to idea. He's just writing this down in a stream of thoughts. So don't be confused that there doesn't seem to be a logic to the story. We attacked the fort. There's no logic to this story. You're inside this guy's head. And if you go inside your head, it's a confusing place to be, isn't it? I'm not offending you, I hope. All going into anybody's head is confusing, trying to find out your motivation. Why did you do that? Why did you call that person an idiot? Why did you think he was an idiot and didn't say he's an idiot? You see what I'm saying? If you go into your mind, if you go into this guy's mind, it's not just going to be a logical read. So in the next paragraph, we learn he's 40 years old and that he's been going on like that, like what? Like he's talking about in his diary, for 20 years. He's been sick, spiteful, and unattractive for 20 years. Remember what he said? I used to be in the government service, but I am no longer. I was a spiteful official. Spiteful is used a lot in this first reading. I was rude, and I took pleasure in being rude. So I did not take bribes, you see. So I was bound to find a recompense in that at least. So he didn't take bribes, but I had to find something else to do. And so I was spiteful. And then he uses the parentheses again, right? Parentheses. A poor jest, but I will not scratch it out. So he's talking, I'm not going to scratch it out. I'm making a joke. I'm jesting. I was bound to find recompense in that. In what? Being rude. So I didn't take bribes. Instead, I was rude. He's joking. He says he's joking. Is he? Is he joking? We find out a little more about him, that he worked for the government. We'll find out why he no longer works for the government later. And then he talks about being a spiteful official. And Jimmy wrote down a note on the side about this type of individual. If you remember this note. Okay? All right. The note. A person who takes pleasure in being rude could be called a sadist, as this term describes someone who derives enjoyment from inflicting pain or humiliation on others, which can show itself as being deliberately rude or cruel. He just said he's rude, right? I was rude and I took pleasure in being so. He's telling us the truth about himself. I was an ass and I took pleasure in being an ass. Well, what do you call that? That's called a sadist. You take pleasure in hurting other people, right? But is the narrator a sadist? Or is he a masochist? A person who enjoys pain is called a masochist. Masochists accept or welcome pain and may feel relief or happiness about experiencing it, according to Google. So this is because the body releases endorphins. You don't have to believe that. During pain, according to what we read about it. Endorphins are a chemical reaction. Part of what happens to us and governs our thinking are, in fact, chemicals. Well, what are you saying, Jim? I should take drugs? No. You better not. But if you experience pain and take pleasure in it, I would start thinking about that, right? But pain is important in understanding this guy. Not only the pain he inflicts on other people, but his own pain. And whether or not he gets pleasure in his own pain. Well, how is that possible? Well, pain is something every human being experiences. And a lot of times when you experience pain, it's not a happy moment, is it? Well, there's different kinds of pain. Physical pain, mental pain. What do you think is worse? Which one? When you experience physical pain, you feel it mentally, don't you? Of course you do, because it's transmitted up there somehow, right? But you could feel like he describes a toothache later. So when you have a toothache, right, you feel your tooth aching, but somehow your mind is in pain. It says, pain, 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 right? In fact, you can't define pain, can you? When you go to a doctor with pain, they give you a little chart. They give you your body. You're supposed to point to the area where you're feeling the pain, and then you're supposed to grade the pain from 1 to 10. How intense is the pain? But they don't know what you're feeling at all. They have no clue what you are feeling when you tell them you're in pain. When you have a toothache, I've got a toothache, unless you had a toothache, right? If you had a toothache, there's some empathy that you can relate to somebody who says, I've got a toothache. But pain is a very personal thing, isn't it? It's like despair. Have you ever felt despair? What is despair? What is despair? It's means loss of hope, isn't it? Have you ever lost hope? When you feel it mentally, despair, how does despair manifest itself, show itself physically? How does that work? When you feel despair, can it show itself physically? Sure it can. Maybe you break out in hives. Who knows? The mind and the body connection is still a mystery, ladies and gentlemen, despite what doctors say, despite it. So do you think this guy's liver is diseased? I don't think. You think the way he feels about pain is manifesting itself, showing itself in his liver? I don't think so. Maybe it is. This is what Jimmy means when he says this narrator is going to take us into a journey. All of us have feelings, joy, pain, belonging, being alone. But the essence of our narrator friend is that he is going to explore these feelings in what he views as acute consciousness versus action. If you read with me, you know exactly what I'm talking about. He thinks he suffers from a too acute consciousness. He thinks too much. And he always describes he's different than men of action. A careful way to understand this journey is to understand now and forever the difference between thinking and acting. Okay, action versus thought. If you're driving in a car and someone pulls in front of you, you instinctively act. You don't think about it, and you don't say, why did that guy do that? You don't start analyzing the situation. You react, don't you? Sometimes you react too late, right? But you react. There's a physical, mental reaction to the event in front of you, all right? You understand that? And later on, you'll see when you read this guy, he talks about being slapped in the face. If someone slaps you in the face, you stop thinking about whatever the hell you were thinking about, right? Same thing. So thinking and acting is a very important part of understanding this character. Very important. So he will not scratch out his just. It's like talking to yourself. And Google says about talking to yourself can be a healthy way to work through problems, to learn from experiences, make decisions, and motivate yourself. It can also help with loneliness. However, certain mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, obsessive compulsion disorder, OCD, can make people more likely to engage in negative self-talk. I hate Google. I have a love-hate relationship with them. Sometimes I love them. But this is crazy. Think about this. You keep a diary. I've kept a diary since I was 17, and I'm an old guy now. But there has never been a day that I regret that, because I can always go back. I can go back and read 30 years ago in my diary, and exactly what I wrote in there brings back the memories. See, we forget things, right? That's why you should keep a diary. You write it down. Not only write events down, I went to the store today, but your encounters in life, your feelings about other people. It's a personal journey where you talk to yourself and you actually sort things through. It has nothing to do making you more. Sometimes you do get more depressed, but guess what? That's life, right? There's ups and downs. You're like a sine wave. Does the narrator, here's a question, does he have a mental condition? I mean, we're only on page 3 or 4 now, right? Is he mental? I don't think so. We're going to see, because I'm sure you suspect he's mental. This guy's nuts, right? He's talking about a liver disease. You're going to have to read the whole book before you answer this question. And that's why the final analysis of this book will include a detailed examination of whether this guy is off his rocker. Now, can we learn anything from a guy that's off his rocker? What do you think? Nah, Jimmy, we can't learn anything from a nutcase, right? Well, I think we can. Because like I said, when we finish this jumpstart, I'm going to read you a couple of quotes from Joseph Conrad, another writer. But let's continue. So the last thing you want to do is jump to conclusions based on so little evidence. We've only started our journey, so you can't just write this guy off. It'd be a mistake. Sometimes when you meet a guy, he does something, you write him off. He's a jerk. Well, how do you know he's a jerk or not just having a bad day? Right? Right? I linked in with an old-time client the other day, right? And I wrote him a LinkedIn message. He didn't answer me. A month later, I wrote him again, and he didn't answer me. And I thought, well, this guy's a dingo, right? Well, then he answers me another couple of weeks later, so it's been like 8 weeks almost. And he said his mother passed away. You know how I felt like a jerk? You know how I just felt like a total jerk? That in my head, I was saying, well, this guy's the jerk. I'm the jerk. I rushed to judgment after only 8 weeks that he was just either too busy, he's blown me off. This is business, right? So you can't do that. You cannot jump to conclusions. Because quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, you just don't know. You don't know. Now, in classical literature, we may know, we may suspect something, we may draw a conclusion, but we have the evidence in front of us. We have the evidence, we can go back and study it. Look at this, the full parentheses, a poor jest, I will scratch it out. I wrote it thinking it would sound very witty, but now that I have seen it myself, I only wanted to show off in a despicable way. I will not scratch it out on purpose. Scratch what out? What did he want to scratch out? Do you remember? He was rude. He wanted to scratch this out. I was rude, but I was bound to find a recompense, at least. He was joking. It was a joke. It was a joke, right? It was a joke. So he's not going to scratch it out. He could have scratched it out, but he didn't. Why? I'm not going to do that. I wanted to show off, but so I won't do it. Spite? You think it's spite? That's what's called these days doubling down, isn't it? He's doubling down. He won't scratch it out because he's showing off and therefore will not scratch it out. Take that. Remember, this is his diary. So, we see shortly thereafter the word gentleman appear in his writing, and he is talking to a group of gentlemen. Or is he? Well, keep it in mind. I think this is an imaginary jury, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. He writes, when petitioners used to come for information to the table at which I sat, I used to grind my teeth at them and feel intense enjoyment when I succeeded in making anybody unhappy. Remember our definition of a sadist? What do you think? Does that fit? Do you ever grind your teeth? I don't know if I know you probably see some jaw action if you're grinding your teeth, and you may wear a night guard because you grind your teeth at night unconsciously. But he would grind his teeth and felt intense enjoyment in making anybody unhappy. They were mostly timid people that he did this with. But then we meet the officer. The officer would not be humble, and he clanked his sword in a disgusting way. I carried on a feud with him for 18 months over that sword. At last I got the better of him, and he left off clanking it. And that happened in my youth, though. But do you know, gentlemen? So, right away, what is he talking about? He would not be humble. See, he expects people to be humble because he has power. He's a civil servant, right? But he clanked his sword in a disgusting way. In those days, he was wearing a sword. How do you clank your sword in a disgusting way? That's a subjective observation. And he had a feud with him for 18 months. Well, what about the McCoys? I forgot the other family's name. The McCoys, right? Feud for years, right? 18 months over what? Clanking the sword and not being humble? I don't know. So, after talking to the officer, these gentlemen, he is addressing emerge. And who are these gentlemen? Well, we know that the narrator is writing, so they may or may not exist. It's not important. What we do know is that this is a diary. Diaries are personal, and they're usually not shared. So we're kind of sneaking a peek. Now, I want you to know, when you look at these pages here, go back and reread it if you need to. Throughout this, Jimmy puts in red arrows. And he's putting in these arrows and all the things he analyzes so that you know there's something going on here you should pay attention to. Okay? And that's what we're going to do for the rest of this, is look at those things. I want you to note his language. What was the chief point about my spite? Well, the whole point was the real sting of it lay in the fact that continually, even in a moment of the acutest spleen, I was inwardly conscious of shame that I was not only spiteful, but not even an embittered man, and that I was simply scaring squirrels at random and amusing myself. So here he's saying, inside of himself, that I'm really not spiteful. I'm not even a bitter guy, but I was just doing this to amuse myself. I might foam at the mouth, but bring me a doll to play with and give me a cup of tea with sugar, and maybe I would be appeased. He's acting. He's telling in his diary that he's really not spiteful. Well, is he? Or is he just saying that? These are, I'm not like that. I'm not like that. Or are you? See? I was scaring sparrows at random and amusing myself. He looks at these people as sparrows, little timid birds, right? Note, too, the red arrows, right? So I want to go through some of these statements that were from the red arrows. The more conscious I was of goodness and of all that was good and beautiful, the more deeply I sank into my mirror, and the more ready I was to sink in it altogether. A mere is a stretch of swampy, boggy down. This is a narrator describing himself. The more conscious I was of goodness, the more deeply I sank into my mirror, which is spitefulness, right? That yin-yang, that comparison. At first, in the beginning, what agonies I endured in the struggle between what? Good and spite, right? I did not believe that it was the same with other people. And all my life, I hid the fact about myself as a secret. This fact that he didn't believe that other people were like him. So he hid it. The narrator was talking about his struggle against disease and depravity, his ailment, his too acute consciousness, right? Which he loses as he tells us. He loses the disease, depravity. I had committed a loathsome action that was done that could never be undone. And secretly, inwardly, gnawing and gnawing at myself for it. What? The loathsome action. Tearing and consuming myself. Till at last the bitterness turned into a sort of shameful, accursed sweetness. Right? Humiliating people turned into accursed sweetness, and at last into real enjoyment. He started enjoying it. At first, this is no good. Then he started enjoying it. Enjoyment. He's admitting this to himself in the diary. Think about this. I insist upon that. I have spoken of this because I keep wanting to know for a fact whether other people feel such enjoyment. Well, you're a person, I'm a person. Do you enjoy when you inflict pain on somebody? When you're being spiteful to somebody? Do you enjoy that? Or do you feel shame because you know it's not right? And that's what this book is about. Morality. What's right? What's wrong? Actions. What are you doing? And ladies and gentlemen, I am absolutely positive, if you've ever dealt with government, civil servants, you ran into this type of person who takes pleasure, and there's some kind people too, but there are persons who take their position of power over you for granted, don't they? I can do this because I'm here and you're there and you're a nobody, right? Right? Well, Jimmy, that's not true. Well, think about it, because it is true. I will explain, he says, the enjoyment was just from the too intense consciousness of my own degradation. In other words, I suck. I'm a horrible human being. And I'm aware of it. And I don't want to be a horrible human being, so I got to feel superior to other people. You see what I'm saying? It was from feeling oneself that one had reached the last barrier, that it was horrible, but that it could not be otherwise. It can't be otherwise. We're all horrible inside. That there was no escape, and that you would never become a different man, and that even if time and faith were still left you to change into something different, you would most likely not wish to change. Or if you did, even then you would do nothing. Because perhaps in reality there was nothing for you to change into. This is one of the essential statements in this book. Can a person change? And why is he doing? Why is he so spiteful? Why is he mean to people? Right? He says to himself, well, I'm not really like that. But the more I realized that I am horrible inside, the more I started to. So he flips it and he starts enjoying the pleasure of hurting people instead of helping people. Are we here to hurt people, or are we here to help people? Read Marcus Aurelius. We're here to help people. This is one of the essential arguments to be examined. Okay? So keep that in mind. The worst of it was, he goes on, and the root of it all was that all in accord with the normal fundamental laws of an over-acute, consciousness. And with the inertia, that was the direct result of those laws, and that consequently one was unable to change, but could do absolutely nothing. So he's basically saying science is telling him, these are the laws of nature. I can't do anything about it. I'm just too sensitive, God damn it. Pardon me. I'm just too sensitive. I can't do anything about my condition. I feel too much. So I got to hurt people. You buy that? Do you buy that? Thus it would follow, he says, as the result of acute consciousness, that one is not to blame in being a scoundrel. He's a scoundrel. He knows he's a scoundrel, but I'm not to blame I'm a scoundrel. It's because I'm too sensitive. Do you see this? This is called, I should have wrote this down. Why didn't I write that down? I'm going to write it down now. Rationalization. Let me spell that correctly. Rationalization. You know what rationalization is? It's justifying to yourself why you do what you do. I'm a scoundrel, but I'm not to blame. I'm just too sensitive. That's rationalization. I can't change. I'm too sensitive. I'm always going to be a scoundrel. Right? As though, he writes, that were any consolation to the scoundrel once he has come to realize that he actually is a scoundrel. But enough. And then he goes, ah! You see that? Ah! It's like he wants a puke. Ah! Here again is the argument of freedom or determinism. Can you change, ladies and gentlemen? If you are a scoundrel, first of all, you have to realize you're a scoundrel. Because if you're a scoundrel long enough, you don't know the difference between not being a scoundrel. You lose the definition of a scoundrel. You understand that? So if you realize you're a scoundrel, can you stop being a scoundrel? Or do you, like the narrator, believe, no, I'm always going to be, I cannot change. This is the laws of nature. Anybody who's too sensitive like me will always be a scoundrel. Do you see what I'm saying? Do you see the depth of what this guy is talking about? He goes on, I say in earnest that I should probably have been able to discover, even in that a peculiar sort of enjoyment, the enjoyment of despair. This is extraordinary. He's saying that when you feel despair, hopelessness, there's a certain enjoyment, certain pleasure. Is that true? Have you ever felt despair? I mean, true despair. True despair. Some of us have been fortunate not to feel true despair, hopelessness. The cup half full, cup half empty. There's that argument there. Optimism versus pessimism. What is despair? In despair, there are the most intense enjoyments, especially when you are very acutely conscious of the hopelessness of your position. There it is. You're so sensitive, you know it's hopeless, and therefore, since it's hopeless, you take pleasure in it. When one is slapped in the face, why, then the consciousness of being rubbed. He says despair is enjoyable. Is it? Can hopelessness be enjoyable? When all hope is lost, what do you do? What do you do when all hope is lost? The slap in the face is important. He says, but upon my word, I sometimes have had moments when if I had happened to be slapped in the face, right, I should perhaps have been positively glad. What does that mean? What the heck does that mean? In the first place, to blame because I am cleverer than any of the people surrounding me. Parentheses, I have always considered myself cleverer than any of the other people surrounding me, and sometimes, would you believe it, have been positively ashamed of being cleverer. At any rate, I have all my life, as it were, turned my eyes away and never looked at people straight in the face. What is that all about? You have to examine this carefully and think about it. He thinks he's cleverer, smarter than everybody, but he doesn't look them in the eye. He doesn't look them in the face. Do you look at people when you talk to them, or do you look away from people when you talk to them? Do they look at you when they talk to you, or they look away? There's something to this. And I am more persuaded of that suspicion, if one can call it a suspicion, by the fact that if you take the antithesis, the opposite, right, of a normal man, that is, a man of acute consciousness, who has come, of course, not only out of the lap of nature, but out of a retort. This is almost mysticism, gentlemen, but I suspect this too. This retort-made man is sometimes so nonplussed in the presence of his antithesis that with all exaggerated consciousness, he genuinely thinks of himself as a mouse, not a man. What the heck is he saying here? Well, basically what he's saying is that he's got acute consciousness, right? And the antithesis of that is a retort man, the man of no consciousness. So he's not a man, he's a mouse. Then he goes into the mouse thing, right? A normal man versus a retort man. He thinks of himself as a mouse. But in that cold, abominable, half despair, half belief, in that conscious burying oneself alive for grief in the underworld for 40 years, in that acutely recognizing yet partly doubtful hopelessness of my position, in that hell of unsatisfied desires, turn inward, in that fever of oscillations, of resolutions, determined forever and repented of again, alas, a minute later, that the savor of that strange enjoyment of which I spoke in lies. He's talking. This is an uncanny admission, translation of what he's feeling in words, ladies and gentlemen. In that cold, abominable, half despair, half belief, in that consciousness where you bury yourself alive in grief in the underworld for 40 years. Imagine suffering like this guy. He's suffering. We talked about physical and mental pain. Mental pain has to be heads over heels, more painful, excuse the pun, than physical pain. It has to be. There's a great movie with Paul Newman where they keep him isolated. It's a Korean War movie. He comes back as a hero, but he was isolated. Loneliness is a destructive emotion. This is the journey I told you about in the beginning. Absurdity of absurdities, how much better is it to understand it all, to recognize all the impossibilities and the stone wall. Not to be reconciled to one of those impossibilities and stone walls if it disgusts you, to be reconciled. But by the way, the most inevitable logical combinations to reach the most revolting conclusions on the everlasting theme, that even for the stone wall, you are yourself somehow to blame. Though again, it is as clear as day that you are not to blame. There's the contradiction. And therefore, grinding your teeth in silent impotence to sink into luxurious inertia, doing nothing. Brooding on the fact that there is no one, even for you, to feel vindictive against, and that you have not, and perhaps never will have, an object for your spite. That it is a sleight of hand, a bit of juggling, a card sharper's trick, that it is simply a mess. No knowing what, no knowing who, but in spite of all these uncertainties and jogglings, still there is an ache in you. And the more you do not know, the worse the ache. I can't think of a stronger statement of depression, of self-doubt, of introspection, of everything we're talking about than what we just read. This guy is, you can just say, write him off and say, well, he's just nuts, Jimmy. I never felt like that. Good for you. But if you don't empathize with someone like this, you will never empathize yourself when you hit that wall. Even the stone wall, for that stone wall that you can't get by, you are somehow to blame. That's an important point we're going to talk about in the final analysis. So there are 185 words in this sentence from the word how. From here to here, there's 185 words starting from how, and it is one of the most intense statements you'll ever read on what? Despair, feelings of isolation, alienation, right? What do you make of it? What do you make of it? Well, that's probably where some of you stopped reading. I don't think you should, but anyway. Even in a toothache, there's enjoyment, he answers. He takes pleasure in pain, his own pain, inflicting pain. He's a sadist, masochist rolled into one. Do you know people like that? Have you met people like that? That torture just for the sake of being mean? You have a boss like that? Or is everybody just good and lovely and kind and it's a world, right? We are one. We are the children, right? It's a beautiful world. Are you kidding me? Do you know what the hell's going on in the world? Think about this. Think about this. Well, it will be clear that by now that this novel is not for everyone. So if you decide not to finish it, Jimmy gets it. I totally understand. But if you push yourself to finish it with me, I'm going to caution you again. You might find out things about yourself that you just don't like. And if you're like the anonymous narrator, you believe that you can't change, well, but if you believe that, you will have to be ready to live with that knowledge, won't you? Because I think there's another point of view. Change is inevitable. I think people can change. You may not think that. But if you read the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, you'll find out that he believed everything changes. You can't step in a river in the same place twice, says the philosophers who taught Marcus. So if everything changes and is changing, you too can change. This narrator can change. He doesn't believe he can change right now. You don't have to be a scoundrel if you are one. Isn't that good news? Or you can be a jerk. The narrator does suffer a lot. He suffers mental anguish, which Jimmy believes is perhaps worse than physical. The slap in the face, for example. And that is what makes Notes from Underground remarkable. And it's this underground man, this anonymous narrator in all of us, where Joseph Conrad once wrote. Joseph Conrad's one of the great writers. He was Polish, but he wrote in English, Billy Budd. A man is much more like the sea, whose movements are too complicated to explain, and whose depths may bring up God only knows what at any moment. We're complex, ladies and gentlemen. And this is a complex narrator. It's perhaps unlike any narrator we've seen so far in reading with classics, right? Although most narrators are complex. He also wrote, Conrad did, it is when we try to grapple with another man's infinite need that we perceive how incomprehensible, how wavering and misty are the beings that share with us the sight of the stars and the warmth of the sun. It is as if loneliness were a hard and absolute condition of existence, the envelope of flesh and blood on which our eyes are fixed melts before our outstretched hand, and there remains only the capricious, unconsolable, and elusive spirit that no eye can follow and no hand can grasp. What a depressing statement. I didn't promise you a rose garden. And finally, Kierkegaard, great philosopher, wrote, to be essentially reflective at an age which is naturally immediate. I need the bullet points now, right? To be essentially reflective when you live in an age that is immediate is the depths of melancholy. They just did a study I read where they took away cell phones from children and their scores for math and reading and behavior actually improved. Go figure. Good luck. And I hope to see you in future 7 readings of Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. You've been reading with Jimmy. This is Jimmy's Jumpstart in Understanding Notes from Underground. You can email me at jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. But you can also visit our website, readingwithjimmy.com, for more classic literature. Thank you so much for coming. Enjoy your day. Don't give up on this guy, just like you should never, ever, ever give up on yourself. Remember, you read to learn how other people lead their lives and how to lead yours. Or not lead yours, as the case of this character. Huh? What do you think? Thanks for being here.